welcome. Today is Thursday, October 5th. I almost said September, but the time is flying. Thursday, October 5th, 2023. The great Alastair Crooke joins us now from the hills outside of Rome, Italy. Alastair, always a pleasure, of course. Thank you for joining us. You wrote an interesting piece lately. All your pieces are interesting, but the most recent one quotes the head of Ukraine intelligence making comments like, the Russians are not even humans. Reminded me, of course, of the Nazi ideology and attitude about the Jewish people and other people. Is this true? Is this a prevalent attitude amongst elites in Ukraine that the Russians are not humans?
Yes, it is, and it's taught in the schools. And it goes back really to the time at which the Banderites were essentially in the Wehrmacht, in the German army. And so in order to make themselves, I think partly in order to make themselves more acceptable to the Germans, they devised this new identity for themselves. They said their identity was basically European, by which they meant it was derived from Vikings and was Germanic, and that their language was also Germanic. It was all untrue. They're Slavs, like the Russians, but they created this identity, and therefore they've come, and you hear this regularly from the head of the security bureau in Kiev, saying, you know, the problem is we're human because we're European, but those Russians, they're Asian, they're not human. And this was very prevalent after the Maidan, during the attacks. You know, many of the civilians, many Russians died in those attacks after 2014, and they were very vicious, and they regarded them as somehow Asian and non-human, whereas the West Ukrainians believed they had this sort of European, if you like, background and European culture, and that they were therefore rather like the Germans. They were, if you like, superior because they were German and Viking, and of course there's no truth. The genomes and everything show nothing of that. And the language is really basically a dialect of Russian, the Ukrainian language. It's not something different.
But this is very, very troubling, Alastair. I mean, it is fair then, is it not, to say that President Putin is correct when he says he's fighting against Nazis and Nazi ideology? If this is what the head of Ukraine Intel, and this is what Ukraine school children are taught, well, the head believes it, the school children are taught to believe it. Does the average Ukrainian, as far as you know, manifest such an internal, institutional, constitutional hatred for the Russians as to regard them as beneath humanity?
Yes, as not being human. I mean, they say that specifically, that they are not human. They are Asian, they come from the Mongols, they are not like us, and they are not human. And yes, it is. And it's very important also, because really this sort of fake identity, system, cultural identity that was created at that time, has been taken up by the West, by Europe and everyone else, who tends to regard Ukraine as an expression of European values. I mean, in the sense that, you know, Europe ends at the Dnieper River, that the whole of the west of Ukraine is basically more European than it is Slav, or more European than it is in any way sort of derived from Russia. So it's very important because this makes it almost impossible to have a negotiated outcome to the war in Ukraine. This is just, you can't have culture war, particularly fake culture war, as the basis for a discussion. And Russia won't do it. and it's extremely bad for Europe to even try and do this, because it's fake, but nonetheless, some of this ideas of culture war between Europe against Russia has sort of permeated into the ruling strata in Europe. And we've even seen revisionism about the last war in Europe when they had the Armistice Day. It was very slyly being presented as Europe against Russia. I mean, it wasn't any longer Britain and the United States against Germany and against Hitler. It suddenly becomes, the European family. They call it the European family. They're careful not to say exactly what that means. It's the European family. We are again fighting Russia. And they were saying this, and this is how this sort of cultural deceit has slipped into the European vernacular, but it really makes it almost impossible. I mean, there will not be a negotiations with the Russians. They're not going to negotiate on that basis because they do regard these people, as you rightly said, they regard them as a form of Nazi.